Welcome. Serotonin, 1,000 fine points for being first. I think he's my witch. No, wizard. He's my wizard subscriber. I think he calls himself a wizard. I won't be looking at the chat, guys, until the end because I got 3 screens up and a whole bunch of other stuff up. Welcome to Camille. You guys have seen him before. He's in an undisclosed location in Eastern Europe. Trying to protect his identity. No, Camille Gregor. And he's going to be helping me go over Mike Winger's latest video on the Gospel of Mark, and we're just going to help Mike fix all the mistakes he made. And Mike, it's okay. You don't have to pay us. We'll do this for free. And I just want to say that most of Mike's followers, I'm going to dare to say something provocative. I think really don't care about this stuff. It's weird that guys like Camille and I care probably. Let me put it this way. I bet you guys like Camille and I care about this stuff more than the average follower of Mike's. And I think Mike even admits this in the early part of his video, making comments like, well, I just know they love Jesus, and that's the main issue. They love Jesus, and sure, this apologetic stuff is great, but they just love Jesus and want to know more of him. And but I think this is a prime example of where when apologists like Mike encourage their followers to adopt and embrace apologetics, that they might be doing more harm than good. They actually might be causing problems because they're going to learn and realize and hear things that they've never heard before or never really thought of before. And so that's what we're going to go do here today. So Camille, you have any introductory thoughts? Let's just make sure your mic's working at least.
Sure. No, let's do it. Hi everyone.
Okay, so I'm going to start it. I got timestamps. We're going to try to do this as quickly as possible, which means we'll be done in 2 hours. And Mike, I know you're going to watch at least some of this. Not everything we're going to say is going to be directed at you. I know in past critiques that's been a complaint of yours. So sometimes we're going to go off script per se, and we're not critiquing you. We might be critiquing a historian or some other line of thought. So don't think this is all on you. But I have some timestamps here that I want to go through. We're not going to play everything, but I think we're going to play most of it. But I'm going to start it right about here.
This person wrote it. Did they really write it? Then they call it genuine. That's what that means. So what you'll hear from everyone, it seems, eyewitness testimony. Now, if you're raised up in the church, you're going to be like, Mark wrote it, and yes. And your answer is correct. But that answer will be challenged and attacked by people. And so I'm going to deal with...
Mike has really lowered the number of times he says the word attack.
Building the case because...
you're welcome, Mike.
There's a good case. And I like good cases for the truthfulness of the scriptures. So, the authorship of Mark. And I'm indebted to Tim McGrew and Richard Baucom, 2 different scholars who've...
That's important. I want you guys to remember that he's using Tim McGrew and Richard Baucom as sort of his go-to guys.
Done a lot of work that I borrowed from and learned from in prepping for this, among others. So we're talking about just Mark, not all of the Gospels, and we're going to talk about what scholars call the quality of being genuine, the genuineness of Mark. When they say, is a document genuine, what they mean is it written by the person to whom it was attributed? People think this person wrote it. Did they really write it? Then they call it genuine. That's what that means. So what you'll hear from everyone, it seems, nowadays, is that all the Gospels are anonymous, and nobody knows who wrote them, and they were published anonymously, and the names that you see on your Gospels were added way later, like so long after, that nobody knew who really wrote them.
Okay, now, if you're listening to Mike right now, and if you're a believer, if you're a follower or subscriber of Mike's, you're thinking, oh, Mike's just saying something that obviously we don't believe, that none of this is true. But I'm here to say, let me bring this up. I think Mike, what he just said, kind of sarcastically or poo-pooing it, I think he believes every word of it. I got the transcript, and this is what he said. He said, seems to me that everybody's saying today that the Gospel of Mark is anonymous, or the Gospels are anonymous. I think Mike admits that's true. And nobody knows who wrote them. I think Mike actually thinks that's true, especially if you use the word know in a strong sense, like you know a pen's going to fall. And they are published anonymously. I think Mike says that's true. And the names that you see on your Gospels were added way later. I think Mike says that's true. Like so long after that nobody knew who really wrote them.
I think Mike would actually say, I think he thinks that the traditional names were attached to the manuscripts from the very beginning. So he would probably push against that. But it's important to say from the start that what Mike is presenting here is the minority view in the scholarly community. Not that there is anything wrong with that, right? It's just I was actually looking up some numbers, and I was able to find that about 75% of scholars who were dating Mark in the last 100 years dated it after 70, which doesn't mean that these scholars think that Mark didn't write it. But I have to tell you that I would say basically everyone who dates Mark after 70 also thinks that it wasn't written by Mark, a disciple of Peter.
Yeah.
So that's a good way to start.
I want to encourage Mike to say you're welcome to take a minority position, but as an apologist who values truth, please let your followers, your subscribers know that, hey, would you say 75%, Camille? 75% of New Testament scholars don't believe a guy named Mark was probably alive post 70 AD who wrote the Gospel of Mark. Is that a true statement?
Yeah, and it doesn't. Those 70% are not just like liberal Bible scholars, right? It includes even very conservative evangelicals like Bruce Metzger. It's
NT
true.
Wright?
Yeah, I think so. It's true that those 25%, at least according to the literature reviews that I've seen, are almost exclusively very conservative evangelical Christians who basically adhere to the traditional authorship because of the doctrine of divine inerrancy and inspiration. I happens to hold a lot of views on the Bible that are in the minority in the biblical community, but I have actually every time I present them, take time to actually communicate to the people that this is a minority view. You have to be explicit about it up front. But there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, and so Mike, this is what I really encourage you. This is going to raise doubt, and so this is why I think you're not going to do this. But you need to tell your followers that there are people who disagree. There are Christian New Testament scholars who disagree with a lot of things Tim McGrew says, with a lot of things that Richard Baucom says. And what you are now saying, a lot of the things that you will be saying in this video, go against what a lot, if not the most, New Testament scholars say. Now, I encourage you, I dare you to say this to your church, your followers, your subscribers.
I'll quote Bart Ehrman here. Bart Ehrman says, some books, such as the Gospels, had been written anonymously, only later to be ascribed to certain authors who probably did not write them, apostles and friends of the apostles.
And I bet Mike Winger agrees with what Bart Ehrman says. I think that the facts that the names attributed to them were put on much later, he agrees with. He
wrote that in his book, Jesus Interrupted, where he interrupts Jesus a lot. Richard Dawkins, who we all know is a great Bible scholar. No, actually, he's not. But Richard Dawkins says, nobody knows who the four evangelists were, but they almost certainly never met Jesus personally. He wrote that in his book, The God Delusion, where he said a lot of other things that were, delusional. It's interesting, though, because the implication is that if you can't even trust who wrote it, that you're supposed to cast doubt upon the text itself. And it's
okay. What he's about to say, in my opinion, is probably the most important thing in this whole video.
It's kind of like a sideways way to get you to maybe doubt the scripture. So I'm not dealing with the doctrine of inspiration here. I believe that the Bible's inspired by God and it's been given to us through human authors. And if we were to find out that someone other than Mark wrote it, it really wouldn't affect me that much, to be honest.
Even if the Gospel of Mark was not written by Mark, it wouldn't really affect Mike Winger that much. This is the real issue. Mike is coming at the Bible, coming at the whole Bible and the Gospels as special, that this is inspired texts. And I know why he believes this, because of prophecy mainly. Prophecy shows that this is inspired texts. But when we're trying to figure out if a text is true or not, historically true or not, then things like authorship, when it was written, where it was written, sources, independence, critiques, these become important when we're trying to figure out if these prophecies are even true or if they were just penned in later. So it is very curious to me that Mike just admits that, hey, you know what, maybe Mark didn't write it, but if that's the case, it wouldn't bother me. It just shows that there's something fundamental, much, much deeper going on here than actually the evidence.
I would be like, oh, we put
too far?
the wrong name on the top of the book. Like, it wouldn't actually impact this all that much, to be honest. But it's still interesting, and it's still worth looking at and thinking about. So we're going to talk about this today. The chief argument here for that Mark didn't write Mark is that it was originally anonymous, and we're going to talk about the historical case, externally and internally, for how we got the information in the Gospel of Mark. Because what they won't tell you, while you're reading Mark, if you read through the 16 chapters, and the skeptics will point this out.
What they won't tell you. It sounds almost like conspiracy theory type. What they don't tell you.
And never does he say, and I, Mark, wrote this Gospel. It doesn't say that. That's true. What they won't...
Okay, remember what I brought up earlier? Mike, he just admitted the first part's true. That they are anonymous, that nowhere in the text will you see... I'm trying to bring it back up. That first part he just admitted. Nowhere in the text does Mark have his name. Hi, my name's Mark, I wrote this. So what he was poo-pooing earlier, he's just admitting, oh, yeah, I agree with that.
Won't tell you, though, is that this was like a standard way of writing a historical work at the time. It was just normal. You don't write your name in the middle of the text and say, I'm the guy writing this. Let me give you some examples. Plutarch.
Just normal. The question is not whether it was normal or standard for that time, because I actually agree, and I think, Camille, you agree as well, that the standard was not to put your name on a lot of texts back then. But in today's standard, do I dare say Western standard, that's not good. When you don't say, when the author doesn't state his name, his sources specifically, we would not trust that. And my point, that what I often say, I said this to Mike Lacona, I've said this to Mike Winger, I'm sure, that we should not lower our standards just because it's the Bible. And I view this, well, this is how it was done back then, so we need to accept it. No, you don't need to accept it just because it's 2,000 years old and that's how people did it back then. You don't have to lower your standards. Did you want to say anything, Camille?
Yeah, I mean, this is actually important to point out explicitly that the fact that the Gospels are anonymous, that they don't contain any explicit authorial claim, is actually not evidence against their veracity or even against the traditional authorship, because as Mike correctly pointed out, there are a lot of ancient texts that don't have any names of any authors attached to them. For example, 1st and 2nd Kings, which I think the reason why the Gospels are not named is because they are basically imitating the historical books of the Old Testament, specifically 1st and 2nd Kings. So that fact alone doesn't count as evidence against what the Gospels are saying. What we are saying is that if they did contain explicit claims, it would be really awesome because our confidence in their content would go up. And there are examples of ancient texts, biographies, histories, where authors are identifying themselves. So
yeah,
it's not like we wouldn't expect that.
Yeah, and we're going to go through some of that actually very soon.
Plutarch, he wrote 50 biographies, never mentioned his own name.
Plutarch.
In 50 biographies. So we don't doubt that Plutarch wrote them.
We don't doubt that Plutarch wrote them? Okay, yes we do. So
can you read this?
Yeah, Camille's holding up a book called Pseudo-Plutarchos.
Yeah, this is so Plutarch wrote a lot of stuff, philosophy and history, and classicists actually now agree that there is a lot of stuff that was attributed to him falsely, meaning he didn't write it. So if you buy it today, it's going to say Pseudo-Plutarch, which means it's not actually by him. This is philosophy. It's a book on music, amazing stuff. But some of the biographies that were attributed to him were actually not written by him. So, yeah.
So when people like me and Camille are accused of having a double standard, well, if you're going to throw out the Bible, you might as well throw out all history. How many times have we heard this nonsense? A lot of history is doubted, especially, when you go back 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 years. And just because there are some works of Plutarch that people say were not written by Plutarch. And if you, and I think that even though Mike is correct, I think he's technically correct that Plutarch never mentioned his own name. I'm not even 100% sure. Is that correct, Camille?
Yes, he doesn't mention his name, but he mentions his grandfather and his brothers, I think.
Okay, which is much better. If we had that for Mark, that would...
Yeah, it would be better, yes.
Yeah. Okay, well, I'm going to keep...
And also you have to remember that Plutarch is not writing about events that he himself experienced, right? Actually, the only point in the biographies where he brings up his family is exactly the only instance where the events that he's describing intersect with the lives of his relatives, right? So when it's relevant, he brings that up. So by the same standard, you would absolutely expect, for example, the Gospel of Matthew say, and then Jesus met Matthew Levi, the author of this gospel, or something like that, right? That would be the same standard as Plutarch.
Okay.
They wouldn't challenge that because that's not scripture, and there's sometimes a double standard when it comes to the Bible. Plato's writings, anonymous. They're anonymous. How do you know Plato wrote those?
So this is the portion of the works of Plato that were attributed to Plato but are actually not by him. So it's a couple of philosophical treatises. There are, I think, 12 or 13 letters of Plato, and classicists now today think that he maybe wrote one of them, and the rest of the letters are forgeries in his name. So yeah, people doubt authorship of Plato.
Yeah, so there's no double standard here, Mike. It's not like we're just picking on the poor Gospels. Historians doubt Plutarch, historians doubt Plato, the works.
Well, because of the historical attribution to Plato. That's always been attributed to Plato, so we go then to Plato. This is pretty simple. Plato, not Plato. That's... Porphyry also wrote anonymously. Clement of Rome, he wrote anonymously. He doesn't write in... Now, maybe on...
Yeah, Clement of Rome is a really great example because actually none of the works that are traditionally attributed to Clement of Rome, scholars now think were actually written by him. So everything that has the title like Clement of Rome on it, or Clement, majority of classicists, I think, don't consider to be authentic. So that's a really extreme example.
Yeah, I think people have to remember 2,000 years ago, what's the term? Pseudonyms? That was common.
Pseudepigraphical, yeah.
Yeah, that was common. They didn't have copyright laws like we have today. History is done way, way better now than back then. And I know that bothers people just to hear that, but it's true.
The top of the manuscript he might have wrote from Clement or something, but not in the text itself. They wrote anonymously. It was standard to have works that were anonymous back then, especially if they were historical in nature. If you were trying to say, I'm writing history, you didn't want to be like putting yourself in the story because it seemed to dehistoricize it, like as if it was more of a story and not...
Yeah, I got in trouble on Mike Winger's comment section because I said, the Apostle Paul, he identifies himself. Does what he said about history less historical because he identified himself? And people... really got mad at me because, these are different genres. You can't compare the two. But no, Paul wrote some history, and he put his name to it. This is why guys
actually, at this point, I would probably disagree with you because if you just take the ancient literature in general, it's much more common for letters to have the names of the authors attached to it.
I'm not denying that, but listen to what Mike said here.
Especially if they were historical in nature. If you were trying to say, I'm writing history, you didn't want to be like putting yourself in the story because it seemed to dehistoricize it, like as if...
It seemed to dehistoricize it. So my question to Mike is, does the fact that Paul puts his name on his works, on his letters, does it dehistoricize any of the history that he's saying? I think Mike would say
Yeah,
no. He would say, of course not.
Yeah, I think when he says history, he's talking about the genre of like a
Yeah.
historical work, right?
Yeah.
So a letter may talk about events that took place in the past, but that doesn't make it history, right? Like a genre of history.
Yeah.
So at this point, I'm with Mike.
Yeah, I think that was the problem when I was in the comment section. Is like when I'm using the word history, they're thinking of a certain genre, and I was using the word differently. Anyhow.
If it was more of a story and not history. That's the idea. E.P. Sanders, he said, the claim of an anonymous history was higher than that of a named work in the ancient world. An anonymous book, rather like an encyclopedia article today, implicitly claimed complete knowledge and reliability. Meaning it's just fitting. You wouldn't expect him to write his name into it like that. It's their way.
Okay, so he talks about this for quite a bit, and this is one of the parts I want to skip. Not that I'm hiding anything, but it's not a lot of interesting things, but there are a few little tidbits here, right about here.
50 AD, he had in his work Dialogues with Trypho. His dialogue with Trypho is like a debate, a written debate, where he's recording complaints against Christianity and his responses to them. So in chapter 103, he says, for in the memoirs, which I say were drawn up by his apostles and those who follow them, it is recorded that his sweat fell down like drops of blood while he was praying and saying, if it be possible, let this cup pass. Justin Martyr refers to the memoirs of the apostles, the memories of the apostles, and then he quotes Luke.
Yeah, see, little things like this bothers me, and it's because he's assuming that the authorship's already known, but this is what he's trying to demonstrate, that we know who the author is. Mike is clearly saying here that Justin Martyr talks about the Gospels and does not mention Mark, Luke, John, or Matthew. Does not. All he says is the memoirs. And then Mike puts an add-on, a tag on that, oh, and then he quotes Luke. Well, we don't know it's Luke at this point, and I don't even think even Justin Martyr did.
Yeah, that's a bit question-begging, right? So this is the portion of the video where Mike basically goes over early attestations of the gospel authorship. Could you bring up picture number 7, because this is actually one of the pieces of external evidence against the traditional authorship that I put together, right? So it's a timeline that starts with the approximate date of the crucifixion of Jesus, and the violet stuff or the purple stuff is when the Gospels were written. So if you hold a minority view, they are early, so 45 to 65, something like that. If you hold a majority view, they are between 70 and 95, let's say. And then I put just the approximate date of all the early Christian authors.
Did you make this chart?
Mention, yeah.
Oh,
that mention or quote from the 4 canonical Gospels, right? It's a bit tricky to date these books because, as if this is the case with the Gospels, some of them have very wide ranges of when they might have been written, right? So this is just an approximate date. But what's very interesting is the color coding. So all the gray authors are quoting the Gospels anonymously, which means that they quote from the Gospels, but they don't actually say who wrote it. They say, for example, as the Gospel says, and they quote from Matthew. Or they, for example, say, it is written, and then they quote from the Gospels. But they don't say, as Mark says, for example. Then we have 2 red ones, which is Papias and Justin Martyr, who say something about the authorship, but it's questionable. With Papias, he mentions Mark and Matthew, but I don't think he's actually talking about the same texts that we have today. It looks like there were different texts with the same authors, with the same attribution floating around. And Justin Martyr, as Mike said, mentions memoirs of the apostles. And in one place, he mentions the memoirs of Peter, but he doesn't say Luke, Mark, Matthew, and John. I think Justin Martyr even doesn't know about the Gospel of John. He never quotes from it. And then from 180 onwards, everyone who quotes the Gospels already refers to them by the names of the authors that we have today. So starting with Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, Tertullian, and then everyone from that point on. And this difference is very difficult to explain on the hypothesis that the traditional authorship is correct. Because you have to explain what happened between 110 and 180. Why is it that before that date, everyone who quotes from the Gospels is quoting from them anonymously, and everyone who's quoting after the date already knows who the authors are? And most scholars think that the difference is actually explained by the fact that the names of the authors were first attached to the manuscript around this period of time. For example, Bart Ehrman thinks that between 155 and 180, there might have been added a first edition of the four Gospels. So this is the first time when they were brought together, and it was published in a Christian community in Rome, which was the most influential church. And because they had four Gospels and they needed to differentiate between them, they actually assigned names of disciples of Jesus and followers of his disciples to them to differentiate between them. And they basically picked names which were like their best guess. They didn't know who wrote them, and they didn't want to lie about it. So they just said, according to Matthew, which doesn't mean written by Matthew. It just means this is what we think, or this is like the community or the tradition that handed down this text. And this hypothesis, I think, explains this data much better than the idea that the names are true, they are the actual authors, and they were always known. They were always attached to the manuscripts. Because if that was the case, why is it that nobody knows about it for the first couple of decades?
Yeah, you would think if the, as J. Warren Wallace puts it, if the chain of custody was so good that it should be blue all the way across on your chart.
Yeah, basically. There's no reason why it shouldn't be.
Yeah, and so we're seeing a pattern here of complete up in the airness to, oh, we have maybe an idea, to, oh, now we know who wrote these. And by the time the historical record is, oh, now we know who wrote these, it's 180 AD. But then there's going to be questions. I know how the Christians think, well, if they're just making up these names, why would they ever use Mark instead of Peter? Come on, Camille.
I can actually give you answers to that if you want to. Like, there are hypotheses. Actually, this is, of course, speculation. Yeah.
Actually, I think Mike brings this up, so we'll bring it. We'll talk about it later. Okay, I'm going to skip a couple more minutes.
150, right? Let's back up more. Let's go to 125 AD. We're getting pretty close with 125 AD. And we have Papias of Hierapolis. So we're going to go to Hierapolis, which is like Asia Minor. He worked to gather information about Jesus and to make sure it was accurate by tracing it to the apostolic sources. So he would interview witnesses and compare what they said about Jesus and try to make sure it went back to the right sources. In particular, he got some stuff from John the Elder, who was a disciple of Christ. So
he got some stuff from John the Elder, who was the disciple of Christ. Now, I'm very curious how Mike knows this. Do you know how Mike knows this, Camille?
Well, I think it's not technically correct, but the book of Papias is not preserved. It was lost, unfortunately. We only have a couple of quotes by authors that were basically talking about what Papias wrote much later. And this specifically comes from Eusebius, who wrote the church history in 4th century. So 400 years basically after the crucifixion.
But isn't it true that most New Testament historians would say that we really don't know who this John person is?
Well, there was a confusion about different Johns. Right. And so some people thought that there was just one John, some people thought there were several, then there were disagreements about who was a follower of Jesus and stuff like that. And it's interesting that this confusion was actually fueled by theology, because the Christian authors who didn't like the theology of the revelation of John were motivated to say that the person who wrote it was not John, son of Zebedee, John the Apostle, but some other John. And if they actually managed to push this view, then it would be easier to kick the revelation of John out of the canon. I think that this is the view that most scholars hold, and this is how they explain why Eusebius doesn't seem to be very keen about Papias. So he basically wants to undercut Papias as a source, because of theological disagreement.
Okay, we gotta keep moving on here.
He had been in his younger years, because he wrote in 125, but he was interviewing these people in the 80s, most likely it seems. So
most likely it seems.
that would have been when John was still alive, one of the oldest living apostles. So here's what he tells us about the stuff he learned, probably in the first century. He says, the gospel was penned by a guy named Mark. Not only is it Mark, but it's Mark that traveled with Peter. He quotes 1 Peter 5:13 to support this. Let me read to you 1 Peter 5:13. She who's in Babylon, chosen together with you, sends you greetings, and so does my son Mark. Now, a lot of commentators think that Babylon here is a reference to Rome. Because as Babylon had the Jews under subjection to the Jewish mind, it's like they're the new Babylon, they have us under subjection. And so that may very well be that he was in Rome writing that. That's quite possible. And there he is with Mark. How interesting.
Is Mike admitting that the Gospel of Mark could have been written in Rome? Is that what you heard?
I think he thinks that.
Okay, I've gotten in a lot of flack in my history for even proposing that the first Gospel was written in Rome or Southern Europe somewhere, 1,000 miles away from the purported events, and according to most historians, a lifetime later. I think you would agree that this is what most historians say at a time when anybody who could say otherwise, what is being written down as history, they're dead, most likely dead. And so it's really good. I congratulate Mike for admitting that the things written about Jesus were written 1,000 miles away from where they actually purported to have happened.
Interesting. Further, Peter is the chief source, not Mark. That's what also Papias tells us. He tells us that Mark's role was to help improve Peter's Greek.
That's false. Papias doesn't say that. Papias says that Mark was an interpreter or translator of Peter. So both, it's a Greek word that has multiple different meanings. But this idea that from that we can infer that Peter knew some Greek and that Mark just helped him out, that's not in the ancient sources. I guess Mike had some notes that he took probably from some other apologist, and he just mixed it up with what Papias actually wrote. And there are a couple of other minor points. Like, for example, he says that Papias quotes 2 Peter to support the idea that Mark was a follower of Peter, but that's not actually Papias saying that, that's Eusebius saying that. But that's not important.
No Greek, but that if you know more than one language, you may not necessarily be able to write well in more than one language. And it seems as though it was to make sure that it was going to communicate that. And Mark has signs of Hebrew or Aramaic, Greek, and Latin influences, which would be interesting as you have Mark and Peter both being involved in the production of it. Plus, there's good reason, again, to think Peter knew Greek because he was a fisherman in a largely Gentile area. Part of the Sea of Galilee was not Gentile, but a large part of it was, and he's doing business dealings with them on a regular basis. And we have...
Where does this come from?
Do we have any evidence of that? That's just conjecture. And this is disputed, like how heavily Hellenized Galilee was. I think scholars think that the more urban the area was, the more Hellenized it was. And Capernaum and villages around the Sea of Galilee, where the Galilee portion of the gospel takes place, were like one-horse towns, basically, or not even one-horse towns, like one dog town. And also there's one interesting thing where Mike begs the question. He probably doesn't realize that. He says, Papias wrote around 120-130 when all the apostles would be dead. But he probably collected his information in 80s or 90s, so 40 years earlier. So because at the end of the first century, there would still be some apostles around for him to interview. But there is no evidence for that. The reason why Mike says that is because this is the only hypothesis that allows you to have Papias having access to any eyewitnesses, right? So he assumes that Papias talked with eyewitnesses because he assumes that Papias interviewed them in the end of the first century. And he assumes that Papias interviewed them in the end of the first century because he interviewed eyewitnesses. It's circular, right?
Well, And the thing is, what I'm about to say will bother a lot of Christians because they will have to admit that they're going with a lower probability hypothesis. If you believe Papias got some information from people in the 80s or 90s AD, then you have to admit I think you have to admit that there's lower than a 50% chance that anybody would have been alive back then who would have walked or talked with Jesus or could have written this gospel.
Yeah, I think John, son of Zebedee, traditionally, there are multiple traditions about what happened to him, but the major tradition is that he died during the reign of Trajan, I think, which means he would be like 90. And that's extremely unlikely in the ancient world. It's like less than 1%. It's not impossible,
Right.
but it's unlikely.
Yeah, like what's the probability that someone will live to 80 to 90 even today in the United States or Canada or in Western Europe? It's still way below 50%, is it not?
We have the sign on the cross written in multiple languages. We have a lot of reasons to think that there was a lot of multilinguality. Is that a word? Multilinguality. That sounds good. I like that. I'm going to use that. Going on back then, just like nowadays when you go to any country where there's mixed populations, you learn a few words, right? Dios te bendiga, right? Like you learn.
Okay, I'm going to fast forward it again to say.
Actually, can you very quickly bring up picture number 6? Because
Sure.
that's an interesting point about Papias. Yeah, so on the left, there is the line of transmission for Papias. It's the information that, or the idea, or the claim that Mark wrote the gospel. And this is how the information is transmitted. This is basically what Papias says, where he got his sources from. So he says, when I met companions of the presbyters, of the elders, including John the presbyter, I learned the stuff. And John the presbyter said that a guy named Mark wrote a gospel based on the testimony of Peter. But Papias actually doesn't say that he personally knew John the presbyter. He says that he knew companions of the presbyters. So the companions would tell him what John the presbyter said. And nobody ever says, like Papias doesn't say, where John the presbyter got the information about the authorship from. That's unknown. He doesn't say, for example, and John the presbyter was a friend of Mark, so this is how he knew it. He says that John the presbyter was a disciple of Jesus, but the fact that he was a disciple of Jesus in Palestine in 30s doesn't make it more likely that he would know who wrote a gospel in Rome 40 years later, right? And on the right, you have a line of transmission for a different claim from early Christian literature, which we know is false. So Irenaeus wrote that Jesus died under Claudius, which would mean that Jesus died later than Pontius Pilate. So this is obviously false. And Irenaeus actually tells us how this information got to him. He claims that he spoke to presbyters in the Roman province of Asia, which is in Western Turkey. And they were told by John, the disciple of Jesus. We don't know which John this is, but it specifically says he was following Jesus. So this is a shorter line of transmission, but the information is still false. So This is the level of attestation that we are dealing with, right?
So what I'm hearing you say, Camille, is if Irenaeus could be wrong and have a shorter transmission than Papias, why do we trust Papias? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, especially given what Papias says about the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of Matthew that he knows doesn't match the text that we have. For example, about Gospel of Matthew, Papias said that it's a collection of sayings and that it was written in Hebrew. But the text that we have today is not a collection of sayings, and it was written in Greek. Like linguists can actually establish that it's not a translation. It was originally composed in Greek. So it's not good.
Yeah. Until we get a time machine, this is why I think some Christians lack humility in saying we really don't know a lot of things 2,000 years ago, who wrote what, where, when, how. Maybe just have a little humility in saying, you know what, we just don't know. we can believe certain things, I guess.
The historical record seems to clearly indicate one clear answer. Now, what's also interesting is the geography of these guys. So if I just took 4 of them, Tertullian, he's in Carthage. Carthage is about 1,100 miles from the next one, Clement, in Alexandria, Egypt. Go another 500 miles north if you go by boat. If you go by land, it's 1,500 miles, and you get to Papias in Hierapolis. Then you can go another 1,800 miles, and you're going to get to Irenaeus in France. And I'm not going sideways here. We're going in a square to get to all these people. These are the 4 corners of the Roman Empire, very much. They had no social media. They didn't have a postal system going on. They didn't have phone calls. Hey, I'm going to write down that Peter wrote. This stuff wasn't going on, but rather it's spread out as the church spread very quickly and churches were planted all over the place. The knowledge that Mark's gospel is read in the churches, received in the churches, and that it's Mark's and that it came through the preaching of Peter is kind of a consistent thing.
Yeah, but Mike, tell your followers, your subscribers, your listeners, how long all that took. Like over 100 years, don't you believe, right? 100 years for it to spread those 4 corners? Isn't that reasonable? Isn't that very doable?
Yeah, and also just very quickly, this is an aspect of, I think, bad epistemology on part of Mike, which I think we've already seen the same thing in his debate with Matt Dillahunty, where Mike thinks that a lack of evidence against is the same as evidence for. So he says, imagine that in different parts of the Roman Empire, the Gospels would have different names. That would be very strong evidence against the traditional authorship. And he seems to think that the fact that we don't observe that is evidence for the traditional authorship. But that's not actually the case. This is the same thing that I was explaining here the last time when we were reviewing the debate. This asymmetry doesn't exist. And I think Mike does this mistake because he doesn't seriously entertain any alternative hypotheses. If you notice that every time he basically presents a view different than his own, he tends to think about it in terms of a conspiracy. Like, either this is true or someone is deliberately lying. But these are not the only 2 options. Like, it's possible that people just were honestly mistaken, right? So if he actually surveyed scholarship and he puts together several alternative hypotheses that are on the table, then he would have to think, is this more likely on my hypothesis or on the alternative? And if he was honest, he would have to say, well, this is actually equally likely, so it's not evidence either for or against, right? And this is actually a lot of the stuff that he says is in this category. It's not evidence against, but it's not evidence for either, because all of the other alternatives can explain that as well.
Yeah.
So now I want to share with you the historical sources that say that Mark actually wasn't written by Mark. The historical sources that tell us that Mark wasn't written at all by Mark and that it wasn't written at from Peter's data or with him as the source. Okay, now I'm going to tell you something else, because there's none of those, right? There's not a single one in history who challenged Mark's authorship until over 300 years later.
This is exactly what you were just saying. There's not a single piece of evidence that anybody challenged this 100 years later.
And those who are responding are like, hello, everybody knows Mark wrote this book. This is silly. So that's in about 400 AD, where it gets challenged, where it finally is challenged. After all these people were dead and gone that I just quoted to you.
After all these people were dead and gone, it's finally challenged. I'm pausing it here because I have a note saying, isn't it ironic that most New Testament scholars will say that after most people were dead and gone were the Gospels written in the first place. And then when people are dead and gone, that's when it's challenged. It's like, oh, man.
And we have a debate between 2 guys, Augustine and Faustus. Faustus, he's the bad guy, boo, right? Augustine, he's the good guy. And Augustine, he's a Christian theologian and philosopher. Faustus,
if it doesn't line up to what I believe, he's a bad guy.
just was a knucklehead. And Faustus, he was a critic of Christianity. He wanted to criticize and attack Christianity. And one of the things he attacked was the Gospels. So again, about 400 AD, first time someone's questioning the authorship of the Gospels, and Augustine has a written debate with Faustus. You could actually go and read it. So he asked the following questions. He's like, it's strange, that Faustus is challenging the authorship of the Gospels because we don't do this with any other historical works.
Yeah, that's a good question. Do you know, Camille, anytime in the first 5 centuries up to, first or 400 years around the time of Jesus, if there was historians at the time challenging works of other authors, or is it basically now in the modern era?
No, it's actually interesting because there were so many forgeries going on in the ancient world. People in the ancient world already were investigating forgeries. Like, for example, Galen, the famous physician, went down a marketplace one day and he found out that someone is actually selling forgeries in his name. So he had to write a book, How to Recognize My Authentic Works. So that was already like a big deal in antiquity.
When was this? What year?
Galen died around 200, so 230 years before Augustine.
Okay.
They were smart back then. They weren't all, like some people just think in history everybody was dumb. Sometimes I read them and I think we're dumb. I read their stuff. And he goes, we don't do this with other historical works. Nobody doubts the genuineness of the books attributed to Hippocrates. Okay.
These are the complete works of Hippocrates. It's about 60 treatises in 2 volumes. Do you know how many of them are considered authentic today? 0. A majority of scholars who specialize in Hippocrates say that none of the works that are attributed to him were actually written by him. A minority think that we can identify some authentic core of maybe 10 or 13, but they disagree which ones. So Augustine, when he said in the 4th century that nobody is disputing the authenticity of Hippocrates, was incorrect, not only given what we know today, but he was actually incorrect in his own time, because Galen, the guy that I've just mentioned, wrote a treatise 230 years before Augustine on how to recognize authentic works of Hippocrates, right? So Mike is basically citing someone who is incorrect to support his view, which is also incorrect. Yeah.
Mike is citing someone who's incorrect to support his view, which is incorrect. That's a good quote to put on a timestamp later.
Augustine says. And then he talks about why. He says, because there's a succession of testimonies to the books from the time of Hippocrates to the present day, which makes it unreasonable either now or hereafter to have any doubt on the subject. How do we know the authorship of the works of Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, Varro, and other similar writers? But by the
I'm not going to do that for every author, but Cicero, some of his works are disputed. Aristotle, I think like 20% of the corpus is disputed.
Yeah, hold those books up again.
So this is what, it's actually interesting. This is one book that was attributed to Aristotle, but classicists don't think it was written by him. But even today, when they publish it, it still says Aristotle, because it's traditional, right? Even though if you read the introduction, it actually says this was not written by Aristotle. So this makes me think like 2,000 years in the future, when people find this, and this is going to be the only copy of Aristotle, and the introduction gets lost, they are going to think that Aristotle wrote that, even though we today think he didn't.
Unbroken chain of evidence. Augustine's saying, look, it's been from time immemorial. We've all known who wrote these books. If you're going to say that you're not going to trust them, you can't trust any other historical works. But this is so often what happens with skeptics that I experience. They have double standards. Oh, I'll take Hippocrates. Oh, I'll take Cicero. But the Bible, nope. Standards like way up here. Where is it? I don't know, somewhere up in the clouds. Just trust me, you can't reach it.
Mike, we've just demonstrated.
I don't dispute. I don't dispute that.
Go ahead.
Paul. Yeah, I don't dispute that Paul wrote 4 letters, right? I mean, if I was hyper skeptical, I would reject those as well, right? I don't have any problem with that.
Well, historian Robert Price doesn't think any of Paul's works are attributed to Paul. So, but I don't think that's unreasonable for a guy like Robert Price to say, because he could be right.
And it becomes this sort of unreasonable skepticism against the scriptures.
Yeah, why is it unreasonable to be skeptical of Aristotle, Plutarch, some of his works? Like, if we can be skeptical about those guys, we can be skeptical about the Gospel of Mark. There's no double standard.
Oh, that's the external evidence. Is it genuine? Well, it sure seems like it. And by any normal historical standards, you would consider Mark to be the author of Mark. But you still have guys like Bart Ehrman saying they're anonymous. They were originally published with nothing written upon them. Well, we actually don't know that they were originally published with nothing written on them. We don't know that. That's
Okay, so Mike's saying we don't know if the names were on them when they were originally published. This is an argument from silence, right? And this, I often get accused
and
of.
I think
Let me finish this. I often get accused of using the argument from silence. Like, no historians talk about the 3-hour darkness when in Matthew 27. So that's an argument from silence, Doug. You be quiet because you can't say that. That's a fallacious argument. And yet Mike is using the exact same thing right now. Well, we don't know that the names weren't put on them when they were first published. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to say real quickly. I think a lot of people are going to be triggered in the chat, but Mike is going to like what I'm about to say. So when it comes to authorial attribution of works from antiquity, that's one of the instances where the claim is actually the evidence. So when Matt Dillahunty says that claim is not evidence, this is one of the area where he's wrong, right? So imagine that we find a manuscript of some work from antiquity, but your manuscript is from 1500s, so centuries after the fact. And it's the only copy that we have. And the author doesn't identify himself in the text, but the title says who the author was. We have no way of knowing if this is true or not, but the null hypothesis, the default hypothesis, is to think that this is true, that the authorial attribution is true. So classicists, historians, they just assume that the authorship is true by fiat. And if you actually want to dispute it, you have to bring evidence against. You have to go against the null hypothesis, right? It just happens to be the case that for a lot of the early Christian works, like some of the letters of Paul, all of the Gospels, not only canonical, but also apocryphal, we have strong evidence that the traditional authorship is false. So we are not being hyper-skeptical. We are just going against the null hypotheses, satisfying the conditions of the alternative hypotheses, right? So, yeah.
It's just something he says. Let me move on. Well, okay, before I get to the internal evidence, I'll talk about the names of the Gospels from the beginning of Mark, but I have some more stuff here that I just forgot about. So, early writers quote Mark. Also, this is separate from like Tertullian and these other guys. We have early writers that are quoting from Mark. We have a large number of them. It would take all day to go through them all. But why this matters is because they seem to expect their readers to believe the authoritative nature of Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, just these specific 4 Gospels. They don't quote from the heretical ones. The Gospel of Thomas, they're not quoting from, right? The Gospel of Judas, they're certainly not quoting from. They're rejecting those. In fact, the people who do quote from them tend to be the heretics that get kicked out of the church. And they quote from them. Why? Because they wrote them, because they're trying to push these up onto the church. Even the heretics, though, like guys like Celsus, who wrote against the Christians in the 2nd century, he says, I've made all these accusations against you, and I did it using only your own books. And he only quotes from the 4 Gospels as far as any other Gospels. So the usage of Mark from the very beginning is kind of a big deal. The fact that the early church utterly rejected these other Gospels means that they cared about the genuineness of the writings themselves. There's one.
You're shaking your head, Camille.
Yeah, you can do the external test of faith and basically say the same thing, just switch the Orthodox churches and the heretical churches. So Mike is basically saying that the Orthodox churches are not using the heretical teachings, the heretical texts. Therefore, the Orthodox texts are genuine. But the heretics were not quoting from the Orthodox Gospels either. So by the same logic, you would have to say that, for example, the Gospel of Peter was really written by Peter because the heretics were not quoting from the Gospel of Mark, for example, right? Yeah. So it's just non sequitur.
One other line of reasoning, too, and it's this. If you're going to make an author, you have this anonymous work and it's about Jesus. And could you imagine, you have this scroll and it's a copy of the Gospel of Mark, and you look at it and you go, I wonder who wrote it. Like, you wouldn't have any way of knowing? You didn't ask. When somebody handed it to you, when you copied it across, it didn't originally have anything written on it. That's the idea that they give. But if you're going to assign a name here and you want this gospel to have authority, whose name are you going to put on it? Peter. Yeah, man, Peter. Thomas, right? One of those guys. Andrew. James. Somebody, not Mark. Mark? Who's that guy?
Yeah, anybody who thinks that these names are just made up, you would put Peter. If you're going to make up a name, you would put Peter, Camille. You wouldn't put Mark. Oh, you're still muted.
Yeah, I think there are alternative hypotheses that can explain this as well. Like, for example, first of all, I don't think that the names were that this was. I don't necessarily think that this was like deception. That someone, let's say that the names are not original, and someone in 160 just decided, I'm going to name this a gospel according to Mark. I don't think that person was trying to like trick people into thinking that Mark wrote it. I think it was an educated guess. So what explains this? So for example, people knew, or it was tradition, that Peter was illiterate. After all, it's what it says in Acts. So people who wrote Acts, they believed Acts says that people couldn't write. Peter couldn't write. So they thought, well, it could not have been written by Peter. But we know from Pauline epistles that there was this guy, or from Second Peter, that there was this guy named Mark who was his companion, so maybe he wrote it. So they just said, okay, we are going to call this according to Mark, because we have 3 other gospels that we need to differentiate. Why not?
Well, most of what we know about the authorship is, well, I think all of it is ends up with Papias, quoted through Eusebius. What if Papias didn't like the Gospel of Mark? Maybe he liked it, but he just didn't like it as much as Matthew. Wouldn't he kind of say, well, what if I put Mark's name on it instead of Peter? Because that kind of makes, well, Matthew was an eyewitness. Mark wasn't. He's just, he has the ear of Peter. So do you think that hypothesis has some merit?
I don't know. It sounds ad hoc.
Definitely it is.
I think there was an idea floating around that Peter left behind some memoirs, which, I mean, it kind of makes sense, because if you have 2 of the most important figures of the early Christianity, Paul and Peter, and you have a lot of writings of Paul, it kind of makes you wonder, maybe Peter left behind something written as well. So there was this idea floating around. But people also knew from reading Acts that Peter was illiterate. So when they found the text, they thought, maybe this is it, but we know that Peter didn't write it himself, so maybe one of his companions was able to write it down for him. And who were his companions? Well, there's this guy named Mark, so let's say it was him. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to fast forward a bit. Remember, if you have any more slides you want me to bring up, Camille, just remind me.
Evidence of what they call a Petrine perspective, or the idea that Peter seems to have been influencing the writing of this work. And so this is where you get into some pretty like detailed theories and things like that. And what I'm sharing with you here right now is from the work of a scholar named Richard Baucom, and he wrote an extensive book on the topic called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. It's a very interesting book. It's pretty accessible as far as scholarly books go. It's very accessible. Doesn't mean you won't have to read the same stuff over and over again.
Oh, Richard Baucom, wasn't that the book you said, Camille, that's one of the worst books you've ever read in your life?
Yeah, I would say it's probably the worst academic book I've ever read. And I'm not just saying that because I don't want to accept Jesus into my heart. I hope I will be able to go over some of the points that he makes in the book now.
But it's pretty good. He says that at the beginning of Mark and at the end of Mark, we have something called an inclusio. And I won't spend a lot of time on this, but let me tell you what an inclusio is. An inclusio is, the idea behind an inclusio, according to Richard Baucom, is an ancient technique of showing who your eyewitnesses are without breaking your story. So you're sharing the history here, and you want to tell people, I have an eyewitness source, but you don't want to say, I'm going to stop the story. Jesus went here, and by the way, everybody who's reading this person here is one of my sources, and then he continues the story. They don't want.
I just want to explain to people who might be lost what's going on here. Mike is trying to defend why the author of the Gospel of Mark doesn't say where he got this stuff from. Now, this is a concern for a lot of Christians because they have to say, yeah, you're right, Doug. The Gospel of Mark doesn't say where this stuff comes from. What's his source? And so guys like Richard Baucom say, well, you really don't have to cite your sources as a good historian. All you have to do is mention their names. And if you mention their names in the beginning of the narrative and maybe at the end of the narrative, then anybody who would doubt that this is historical could go find those people and double check. But the problem with that is this would also work with fiction, especially if the people you need to double check with are already dead. And so here's one of the major problems with inclusio. Did you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, so it's important to realize that this idea that this literary technique of indirectly indicating to the audience who the eyewitnesses are, we have no evidence that this actually existed in antiquity. This is something that Richard Baucom made up as a hypothesis, which would be fine. But the problem is that he needs to provide some evidence to think like this is plausible. This is something that authors in antiquity actually did. Because otherwise, it's just completely ad hoc. You can take any work, you can take Harry Potter and basically say, identify the first occurrence of a character and the last one, and say that everything in between is their eyewitness testimony, right? So we need to provide some plausibility. And Baucom actually tries to do that. He cites 2 examples outside the New Testament where he thinks the author is also using this inclusio. But the problem is, and this is hilarious, this is one of the reasons why I think the book is atrocious. The first example is Luciano's, his book Alexander the False Prophet, where Baucom thinks that there is a character which is also the eyewitness source for Lucianos. The character only appears halfway in the book, so it's already dissimilar because he thinks that in Mark, Peter is at the beginning and at the end. But the problem is that Alexander the False Prophet is fictional. So it's not actually a real story. It's not history, right? And the second example, and this is even better, is Porphyry, his biography, Life of Plotinus, which is great because it's a biography, just like Mark is supposed to be a biography of Jesus. And there is a guy named Amelius, who is an eyewitness source for Porphyry. And Baucom says, this is an example of inclusio, where Porphyry is indicating that this Amelius is the eyewitness source. But the problem is that in the biography, Porphyry actually says, Amelius is my eyewitness source, which is completely, exactly the opposite of what inclusio is supposed to do in the Gospel of Mark.
How could Richard Baucom make such mistakes? Like, did he not have a proofreader? What do you think happened there?
Well, I wouldn't say that if the book was not that bad, but I think that these kind of errors, this is like one of the 5 things on the same level of magnitude that I can just list off the top of my head. So I think the severity of the problems like really makes me think that this is not due to incompetence, that he is basically being intentionally deceptive. Yeah.
That's a big charge.
I wouldn't probably say that about anyone else. But if you know something about like ancient history, ancient literature, you don't have to be expert. You just have to like know the books that he's citing. I read those books before reading Baucom, I immediately
Camille, since you're in an undisclosed location in Eastern Europe, are you saying that Richard Baucom is lying for Jesus?
I think that's a hypothesis that better fits the data than the hypothesis that he's just incompetent. Because I would never say that about like William Lane Craig or about Mike, right? But the level of these problems in this specific book is so great that I think we are justified in believing that.
Okay, the next 30 seconds or 40 seconds, I think it is in my opinion, the second most important thing Mike says in this video. Most people are probably not going, what do you mean, Doug? The first most important thing, if you came late, is that Mike believes the whole Bible is inspired to begin with. So whether Mark wrote Mark, it wouldn't really bother him that much. And that's almost a quote. I probably paraphrased him a little bit, but he said that in the beginning. So we know this is not the real issue, but listen to what he says coming up here soon.
I'm going to do that. So they would just use an inclusio. The inclusio is like having the person's name at the beginning and the person's name at the end of the work. It's like they're at the beginning, they're at the end. They have a prominent, specific kind of role. And Baucom points to other ancient works that do this as well to try to build a case for it. If you're interested, you could check out his book. But get the second edition one, because in his second edition of Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, Richard Baucom responds to critics who think he's wrong. Because he is coming against a lot of scholarship here. But I think he rightly demonstrates why a lot of the scholarship is just assuming things that isn't evidence.
Mike is admitting that Richard Baucom, probably the major source of his video that he just produced, he's admitting that, at least on this point, that Baucom is in the minority, that he's coming against, what did he say, coming against a lot of scholarship. So this is the type of thing that kind of bothers me, is you need to let your followers, your subscribers, your Christians know this. Hey, the guy I'm using here, a lot of scholarship goes against. Let your followers know this, Mike. And another question I have for you, Mike, is the scholarship that's gone against Richard Baucom, have you read them? Do you know what Camille just said 5 minutes ago? Does it bother you if you did? Do you just stuff it in that tiny corner in your heart, and just when it gets full, you just stuff a little more? Like,
so you put them into bookends. Now, if you look at Mark 1:16, we actually have the first mention of Peter. Mark 1:16, it says, "And as he was going along by the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and Andrew, the brother of Simon, casting a net in the sea, for they were fishermen." He also notes that Simon Peter, same guy, that his name is mentioned twice right there. Simon and Andrew, the brother of Simon. So he has his name twice. In the Greek, it's in there twice. In some translations, they just put it once because it's awkward. Why not just say, and Andrew, his brother? Then at the end of Mark, in Mark 16:17, it says, the angel tells the women, "Go tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you." And we have the disciples and Peter. And Peter is mentioned there. And it seems slightly odd. Why and Peter? I mean, is Peter one of the disciples? Yes, clearly. There's some other reason why and Peter's being mentioned here. You can get more into that. This is just one argument. It's not the whole case for the internal stuff on Peter. I'll share some other things now, though, and I'll let Richard Baucom explain the rest. If you're interested in that, you can check it out. He might have something online that you can find as well. If you,
I actually think that's probably one of the best points Mike has made so far, is, why just put in and Peter? Why single Peter out? Do you have any comments about that, Camille?
Yeah, I mean, there is this idea that the Gospel of Mark specifically has this Petrine perspective, that, for example, Peter appears more often than in the other Gospels, but that's actually not true. If you count those appearances, Peter actually appears the least, or he's named the least of all the Gospels, all the four Gospels.
You sure about that?
He appears. Yes, he appears 26 times in Mark, 28 times in Matthew, 29 times in Luke, and 39 times in John. You have to take into account that the different length, right? Like Matthew, for example, is much longer than Mark. So if you actually divide the number of words by the instances that Peter appears, he appears in Mark once per every 584 words, but in John, he appears once per every 490 words. So by the logic that Baucom is proposing, we should be saying that actually it's the Gospel of John that's based on the eyewitness testimony of Peter, because that's the one that's Petrine perspective, right?
I take it back. That was a good point by Mike. And I think did Mike quote the long ending of Mark? I think that was just a mistake, a typo, so to speak.
You don't want to buy the book. Also, there's more stuff. Peter is referenced in Mark more frequently than in any other gospel. His name, Peter, he seems to be referenced. He seems to have a special place in the Gospel of Mark.
Okay, so that's easily fact-checked, Mike. All you have to do is open up Bible Gateway, go Mark 1 through 16 or whatever, Mark 1 through 20, and then go Control F, and then type in Peter, and then count the number of instances. This is very simple.
Yeah, or Simon or Simon Peter.
Right. Okay.
Either of them works. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to fast forward it now. Was there any slides you wanted to bring up yet at this point? Because I'm going to fast forward, I think, 4 minutes here. And I'm not sure if there's anything important that you think is important in those 4 minutes, but we'll find out.
Because to the community that was listening to the gospel originally, they knew Bartimaeus. And so they're like, oh, yes. And
Okay, so this is, he's saying why people bring up specific names in the Gospels if those names didn't exist, or if it was all just made up.
Bartimaeus was there. So then they mention his name. Whereas when they're mentioning some people that they're not named, well, they weren't accessible to the community, so there's no point in giving their names.
Yeah, so I don't know exactly how you pronounce it. Bartimaeus he was a blind man. And so I don't know if Mike's mentioning this as a form of inclusio again, that this is a source that people could double check. I think that's what he's doing here. But what is curious to me is that there is a parallel story of Bartimaeus, the blind person, I think, in Matthew. And in Matthew's gospel, he doesn't mention specific names. Now, one wonders, does Matthew say that because people were tempted when they read Mark to double check, and so he kind of and they couldn't find these people, and so Matthew said, you know what, let's scrub these specific names because nobody can find them. Or maybe they were just dead at that point. I don't know why Matthew doesn't mention it. But in Matthew 20 verses 29 to 34, a lot of historians say that this is a mere story to that part in Mark, and that it's not present. You can say something, Camille, if you need to.
Yeah, I mean, the fact it's true that there are some characters in Mark specifically, they just show up and they don't serve any specific function. But again, I think this is an instance of Mike not seriously considering alternative explanations. I can give you like 3 alternative explanations for that just off the top of my head that scholars actually propose. But what's important is that even if this was true, it doesn't necessarily point to eyewitness testimony. It could be true that those people were there during the crucifixion, for example. It was remembered that they are there, but the Gospel of Mark is still not based on eyewitness testimony, right? The eyewitness testimony is not the only way how to get information from point A to point B. You can have oral tradition, you can have prior written sources. So again, this doesn't make the eyewitness testimony hypothesis more likely than its alternatives, right? That's why it's not evidence for or against.
I want to bring up one point. The story of Lazarus in Luke, it's clearly a parable, but yet we have a specific name of Lazarus dying and going into the bosom of Abraham, I think it is. So why such a specific name if it's clearly fiction? So it's not for sure that just because an author names a specific name that it's a real person. Okay, I'm gonna fast forward it again a little bit, and
the women, and this is really interesting stuff. They're present not just randomly, but they're present at the cross, at the burial of Jesus, and then at the discovery of the empty tomb in particular. And the women are Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the Less, and Joseph, that's her kids, and Salome. And then at the burial, that was at the cross, at the burial, it's the 2 of them, Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of Joseph. And then at the empty tomb, it's the 3 again. Okay,
so Mike is bringing the 3 women up here to show, again, another source for the author of Mark. Have you heard Dennis R. MacDonald's take on why there's these 3 women? Do you want to say what it is?
Yeah, I think it has to do something with Homer, right?
Yeah, it's Homer's, or it's the Iliad, book 24, and it's Dennis R. MacDonald is a New Testament historian who I've interviewed, who says that Mark mentions these 3 specific names because he's imitating Homer's Iliad, and where there's 3 women who anoint Hector's body, and one is Hector's wife, one is Hector's, I think not lover, but friend, close friend, and what was another one? Oh, and then Hector's mother. And in Mark, we have Jesus' mother and Jesus' close friend Mary, and then Salome, who I think is known for her promiscuity. Is that true? And that kind of mirrors Helen in the Iliad. So now this type of thing just bothers Christians to no end, that maybe the source of this information is not history, that it actually was taken from previous stories, that a well-educated Greek-speaking and writing author of that time would have read Homer's works. That's what they would have read in school, just like we today read things in school. And so these authors, these stories are in the back of their mind. These themes are in the back of their mind when they're writing. Okay, you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I just want to make sure, just want to point out so that we don't we don't look like we are just in like a circle jerk, right? I don't actually buy that. Like, I'm not convinced by the idea that Mark is imitating Homer specifically. So we would disagree there. But I think even if you don't think that, obviously the women are become part of the story at that point, because that's the point where the male disciples fled. So one of them betrayed Jesus, Peter denied him, and the rest of them fled. So women are the only people around. And I think this is a theme of Mark, which is the reversal of expectation, where the people who before then were the closest to Jesus, so his male disciples, who are the only one who are mentioned. Women are never mentioned before, certainly not these women. Actually, they never understood him. They betrayed him. They denied him. They abandoned him. And in Mark, they are never rehabilitated, because if you read in Luke Acts, they have like a character arc where they start dumb, but then after the resurrection and the appearances, they have their minds open. They are filled with the Holy Spirit, and in Acts, they are basically like superhuman, right? They are acting miracles, raising people from the dead, and stuff like that. But in Mark, they are actually never rehabilitated. They just flee, and we don't hear from them again, because in Mark, women never tell the disciples, right?
Yes.
So I think that's the reversal of expectation.
Well, the fact that the women never told anyone in the book of Mark, and it doesn't say that they told anyone, that's evidence that the story is fiction. Because people who read Mark's gospel says, wait a minute, I've never heard this. I remember when I was a young boy, I heard about Jesus, but now Mark this author is telling me the story about the tomb and so forth. This is news to me. And then, this is the reason why I don't know about it, because the women told nobody. Only they knew it. That's why the word didn't spread around. And so that's a hypothesis of why the author of Mark would have these three women go to the tomb and tell no one, is because he is creating a fictional narrative. And within it, explaining why, if anybody's going to say, well, this didn't happen in history, well, here's the reason why you don't know about it. It's because they told no one. Okay. I have no more notes, but there's about 7 minutes left. Should we just do you know if there's anything in particular? I should just play it through?
I think, the names.
Okay, here we go.
Interesting how Mark brings these women in at that point. And they're not just around. They're not just present. They're present doing one particular thing. If you read the verses where these women show up at these pivotal moments, the burial,
like 2 minutes
the crucifixion, the burial, and then the...
Yes.
I want to find the part where he's talking about the names.
I think that's kind of neat. I think that's pretty interesting. And Richard Baucom says that this study of names has been largely neglected in scholarship. They just don't even talk about it. They don't deal with it, generally speaking. Now, some people would say, oh, come on. What if Mark just made up those names? And he just wants to make his story sound more real, right? Like, I'm going to put people's names in here to make it sound more real. We have a good reason to think that that is not what happened. We have a bunch of good reasons. For one, we have no historical works like this ever, like from the time. There's no historical work where someone does this like carefully constructed historical lie. Like, this just doesn't exist, right? We also have...
Whenever I hear of an apologist like Mike say, we have no historical works, I sorry, but if you're a Christian listening, your BS detector should be going off at this point. Alarm should be ringing, even if you know nothing about history, because he's making very, and I'm guilty of this too, because Camille told me I should put on my title of this video, Mark did not write the Gospel of Mark, but we don't know. But but when we're talking about history, we have to talk in terms of probabilities, not categorical, sweeping, no, yes, this is what definitely happened, this is definitely what not happened.
As the later Gospels were written, they lose names, they don't add new names. Right? And then when they finally do start having much later Gospels, false Gospels, where they add new names, they add the wrong names, and that's where it gets exciting. This is not exciting, right? But this part's not exciting, but the results of it are exciting. Okay, there has been a study of Palestinian names from the time of Jesus, looking at the Dead Sea Scrolls, looking at the biblical texts, and then looking at ossuaries. Ossuaries is the number one source. The ossuaries are these like bone boxes they find in graves, and they look at them and they look at the names that are carved there.
Okay, this is really good. So Pay attention to what Mike's saying here.
And they go, this is the kind of things people were named back then. Like nowadays, people don't have the same names as they used to. Have you noticed that? Like my grandma's time, it was Norma, Dorothy were common names, right? I don't know any Dorothys now. So someone tells a story from back then, they're going to try to pick period proper names. Well, there's no way. I mean, you couldn't Google period proper names from
There's no way.
the 1930s. Like, you can't do that in the first century. Mark seems to have period proper names, so let me explain. There's an Israeli scholar by the name of Tal Ilan, and she compiled this list of names, not for any sort of apologetic work or anything like that, but it's called the Lexicon of Jewish Names in Late Antiquity, and you're welcome to read it if you ever have insomnia. What she found is that some names were extremely popular inside Israel, and yet different names were popular outside Israel. So even at the same time, different names, different popularity levels. Other ones were very rare. So Richard Baucom, he took the work that she did, the research she did, and then he compared, leaving out the Gospels, and just compare the Gospels' names to the names found in ossuaries and the Dead Sea Scrolls, and to see what we get. And he found that the most popular names in the Gospels and Acts, the top number one.
For people who might be drifting off, what Mike is saying is, look, this has to be history because the names match with the popular names of the time. And if this was just all made up from a guy in Rome, which Mike admits was the Gospel of Mark was probably written in Rome, how could he just know what these names, the names that he made up, would be right for that time?
Name. Anybody have an idea what it was? You're going to say Judas, but it wasn't Judas. No, it was because there's a lot of Judas. It's Judas, not Iscariot, remember? But it was the most popular male name was Simon. Simon. Now, in the writings of also Josephus, his writings, we have a list of names as well. So in Josephus and in the ossuaries and in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have Simon as one of the most popular names. It's number one in Josephus and the ossuaries. It's the second most popular name in the Dead Sea Scrolls content. Simon. Oh, it's period appropriate, isn't it? Then the second most popular name at the time was Joseph or Joseph. Same name. This is the second most popular in Josephus and the ossuaries, and it was barely the most popular, edging out Simon in the Dead Sea Scrolls. In Alexandria, on the other hand, the second most popular Jewish boy name was not Joseph, it was Sabbateus, or Sabbatias, because they just had different names, different areas, different names, different influences. They weren't the same. If you take the top 9 names from these sources in around the first century, it actually goes from before to a little after in that time.
Okay, listen to this. If you take the top 9 names, where did 9 come from?
If you take them, the top 9 names, they included 41% of the names were these same 9 names for boys. In the New Testament, 40% of the names we find are those names. It's not just the names, but the ratios of the names. And
Okay, I have a hard science background, Camille, and again, my BS detector is going, woot, woot, woot. It's flashing red. What if I take the top 10, top 15, top 4? Like, would I get a different result? Is this?
Yeah, exactly. So could you put up picture number 4, please?
Okay, number 4.
I don't think it's going to be readable. Yeah, there we go. It's
I made it
readable.
as big as I could. So
good. Yeah, So there is a chapter in Baucom's book about names.
by the way, just let the Christians know. Yep. WTF stands for what the fudge. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, wireless telecommunication facility. It's a Orwell reference. So there is this chapter on the frequencies of names in Palestine, and the chapter is like very long, and 99% of the chapter is like very detailed minutia about how Baucom selected those names, because you have to make some judgment calls, like you have to make decisions about which characters are fictional, which are historical, and stuff like that. And this couple of paragraphs is the extent of his statistical analysis of his data. So he collected 3,000 names. He spent dozens of pages describing the data. But then when it actually comes to analyzing the data, this is it. So what he did is you have a list of top 10 male names in the Gospels, and then top 10 male names everywhere else. So in Josephus, Dead Sea Scrolls, ossuaries, and stuff like that. And he picked top 2 and top 9, and he compared the percentages, and there is a match. And based on that, he says the percentages of men in the New Testament thus correlate remarkably closely with those for the population in general, based on 2 data points. And Doug, you're wondering why did he pick top 2 and top 9? These are the only 2 data points that actually match. If you pick any other data points, they don't match.
How do
If
you
you
know
pick
that?
top 3, well, because you can actually do the analysis yourself. If you put up picture number 2.
Okay. Let me get rid of
Sorry.
4.
Picture number. That's not it.
3?
Try number 1. Yeah, this one. So this is actually like one way how to do a proper statistical analysis. This is a scatter plot, right? So on one axis you have the rank, and on the other axis you have the cumulative percentage. And as you can see, there is no correlation.
What's on the
So basically,
axis? Do you know?
I think this is actually not by me, by the way. There is a guy on YouTube who read through Baucom's book, and he put together a very detailed commentary on that. It's like 20 hours long, so if you have a lot of time, you can listen to it. And he brings a lot of the same points that I
After
have.
this, link
And
it. After this, link it in
yeah,
the comments.
I will. Yeah. So this is a chart that was made by him. And the point is, there is actually no correlation in the data. And I think what Baucom did, he cherry-picked the only 2 data points that actually support his hypothesis.
The 9 and 2.
And if you pick any other, you're not going to get the result that he wants to, which is like criminal. If he did that on an undergraduate course in like sociology, history, economics, he would get failed, because like that's the number one thing that you're not supposed to do, right? Yeah.
Okay. And so, which is Baucom's conclusion.
Yeah, this is also hilarious, right? So he repeats that how like amazing this result is based on 2 data points, and then the last sentence is that he's comparing names in the New Testament, then names in Palestine, and then he compares the names in the diaspora, meaning the names that Jews were using outside Palestine. In reality, all of those diaspora names are from Egypt, because that's the only region where we have a lot of Jewish names that we can actually draw a sample, right? So really, it's the name of Jews in Egypt. And based on the comparison between New Testament names and names in Egypt, he says that these names could not have possibly resulted from the addition of names to the traditions outside Jewish Palestine, since the pattern of Jewish name usage in the diaspora was very different. So as you can see, there is a very strong language here. So it could not have possibly. Do you know what was the sample size of the names from Egypt? Like how many names he had from Egypt that he was comparing to the New Testament? There were 3,000 names in total. So do you know? Take a guess. Like the conclusion, it could not have possibly been that way. So what sample size is motivating that conclusion?
So you're saying the sample size for the Palestine area is 3,000, or the combined was 3,000?
The total number of Jewish names is 3,000. So how many of them are from Egypt?
For him to make such a thing, it should be half. It should be 1,500.
It's 45.
45. Yeah. What you said, the language. Okay, I have 2 graduate degrees. Camille, you have 1?
Yeah.
You have 1 graduate degree. So I've been around a lot
PhD.
PhD. Yeah, I just have 2 masters. But anyhow, so I've been around a lot of academic types. Now, Mike Winger is using Richard Baucom as one of his main sources for this video. And it, right in the center of this quote, could not possibly have resulted. This is not language this is my opinion, this is not language an intelligent person speaks, especially as an academic. You might say very probable, very improbable. That's the type of language intelligent academics use, not could not possibly have resulted. That's what a high schooler would say. Am I wrong here, Camille? Am I being too emotional about this?
Yeah, and the reason why this is really driving me crazy is that, like, what we are saying, people, they are not researchers. Like, I think that at some level they don't really care. They just want to pick the book and recycle the conclusion and basically show that we have good reason to believe that the Gospels were written by eyewitnesses, right? And it actually, Inspiring Philosophy, for example, uses the same research. And so they are never going to know about this, right? But the problem is that
I wouldn't go that far. I wouldn't go that far. But the problem is, like, if guys like Mike from Inspiring Philosophy or guys like Mike from Mike Ringer's channel, if they actually know what you're talking about, have seen what you've shown here, there's a deeper problem, and that is that they're not telling their followers this. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. But the problem is that they are just happy to grab like a summary of Baucom's work and say, yeah, there is this great scholar who have concluded that the Gospels must be based on eyewitness testimony. But the problem is that Baucom is not only in minority in the biblical scholar community. As far as I know, he's pretty much the only one now who is actively putting forward arguments for the eyewitness testimony behind the Gospels, right? So this is really the top guy. Like, if you read the reviews of his book, and if you read other very conservative evangelical scholars that cite him, you would think that the book is amazing, because they are saying, like, he revolutionized the field and this is the best case that we have right now and stuff like that. But if you actually read the book, it's shit. I'm sorry, but it's just this.
What are we looking at here? This is, I think, the only one we haven't brought up yet.
Yeah, sure. So this is basically the one axis is the rank of the name, the frequency of the name, right? So on the left, you have the top, the first name, then the 10th name, 20 name by popularity, going, I think, to 100. And the other axis is cumulative percentage of usage, right? So it goes up over time. It goes to 100, which is all the names. And this separates the various sources that make up the total number of names in the dataset. So you have Josephus, you have the ossuaries, you have Dead Sea Scrolls, I think something else, and then you have the New Testament. And you can see that even if you separate it like that, the distribution of names in the New Testament is a little bit different. So it doesn't fit, right? I don't think even this result is significant in the other direction. I think this is just because this New Testament is much shorter than these other sources of data. There is much less names in the New Testament that you have from ossuaries and Josephus and stuff like that, just because it's a smaller pool. So I think this is just an artifact of the small sample size.
But you're saying,
if I, for example,
but you're saying, though, that if Mike's case or Richard Baucom's case was really strong, that bottom line should match more closely with the other lines.
Well, what I'm saying is that you can take everything that Baucom says about his methodology, you can take this data and conclude that New Testament is probably fiction, because the names don't match.
Okay, I gotcha. Okay, I think we're almost to the end. I think did we show that? Yeah, we showed that. Did we miss any slides of yours?
I think I'm good. I've covered everything that I wanted to. I can now rest.
Yeah, you can rest. Although I do want to bring this up because this is fun. Earlier on, Mike was saying that that the author of the Gospel of Mark knew the geography of the Palestine area quite well, and but no. Do you remember? Someone in the chat, was it what chapter in Mark where he talks about Jesus going from Tyre to Decapolis area by way of Sidon? And as you can see, that anybody who understands the geography of that time would not have taken that route. And I've joked in the past before that maybe Jesus had to pick up some dry cleaning in Sidon on the way to the Decapolis area. And so that's why he had to make that detour. But I forget what chapter that is. So who's that on your lap?
Yeah, it's my daughter, who should be sleeping for like 3 hours already, but she's not. Do we have any questions from the chat?
Oh, that's a good question. Let me... I doubt it, but if you have any questions, tag me, and maybe we'll spend 10 or 10 minutes, 15 minutes taking questions. Let me first do a little bit of housekeeping, and so I can see you. Let me get rid of that.
That's what you have to do on YouTube, right? Either babies or puppies to get those views. I think we sealed the deal with the baby.
Any questions? I'm going up Nick Jr., PineCreek art, and there are argumentation stems from hunger. Yeah, this is all out of context for me now, so it's going to be hard to... If there's any donations, thank you. I'm not sure if there was, but I did not see the chat at all. Troy N., you can double check with the 3 witnesses in the Book of Mormon. Yes, the Book of Mormon has 3 signed signatures, way better evidence than the Gospels, but since the evidence is so good for Mormonism, we know it's probably false. What PhD does Camille have? Political science, is that right?
Yeah, it's not related to this. Although I'm going to get education in ancient history starting in autumn.
Yeah, so you guys should be nice to Camille because he might be famous someday. Camille might be a guy that people like Mike Winger might reference someday. Well, Professor Camille Gregor said in 2022. No.
Yeah, I think I'm going to get a PhD and pull Lee Strobel and become rich and famous.
Does Camille have a YouTube channel or webpage?
No, not at this moment, but I'm thinking about it. So far, my names for my YouTube channel are either Poor Man's PineCreek or Indoors Epistemology.
There you go. Faith is Gullibility, $20 donation. Thank you so much. Great work as always, gentlemen. Well, thank you for listening. I know a lot of people don't care about this stuff, but Camille and I are a little bit weird, and we do. Trevor Lunn, do we have much of a record of Mike Winger correcting or withdrawing videos with claims he no longer uses? I think he has admitted being wrong before. I can't tell you off the top of my head. But if he has a video where he said something wrong, I'm okay with him. Like, he shouldn't remove it. He should leave that for the record and then, just admit that was a mistake. I'm on record I've told my friends in private circles that, hey, I make a mistake. That's an opportunity to show that I'm human and say I'm sorry and correct the mistake. Why not bring Mike on and tell him this stuff live? Nick Jr. asks. Well, he was scheduled to come on, but unfortunately we ran out of time. No, Mike is welcome to come on. In fact, Mike, if you're here listening and lurking in the shadows right now, you could come on. We can make this another hour, but I don't think he's here. But the reason why it is better for, I think, guys like me and Camille just to get out what we want to get out, and then if Mike has a problem with it, then if he wants to talk to us, he can. PineCreek is my adult pacifier. Baucom West, PineCreek, I noticed that the Bible seems like the perfect money-making tool. The New Testament denigrates money, encourages giving it all away. Could this be part of the motivation of the authors? Ooh. Well, this is why some people think that the Romans were involved with the creation of the Gospels, because it says, give unto Caesar what's due to Caesar. It's like, that's something a Roman would say, right? A Roman government official. Baucom West, PineCreek, I noticed that the Bible seems... Oh, you ready? I just read that. Hey, Chet. Welcome here. Everyone be good to Chet. He has the power to ban you.
Yeah, just for the record, I don't think that the Gospels or New Testament was put together for monetary gain. I think we should not ascribe to malice what can be explained by stupidity.
Reed had a question for you. Where was it? What is the minimum evidence that Camille would accept as sufficient evidence for the resurrection?
Ooh, for the resurrection. I was thinking like minimal evidence for the traditional authorship. But the example that I always give is, imagine we find a manuscript from first century Mesoamerica, so like the Maya Empire, and it would very clearly and explicitly describe an appearance of Jesus. The reasoning is that, as far as we know, these two regions of the world had no connection, so there would be no way for something like that to take place. At that point, you basically have either a god, aliens, or time travel. So it would be a very nice piece into a cumulative case for Christian theism.
Rob Plutonium says, love you, Doug. I love you too. I guess. I don't know you. No. I would be a man of integrity. No, I don't love you, Rob, because I don't know who you are. No, I've seen you here before, but I like you. How's that? Mark Caesar, should I post a link people can donate to? No. If people want to donate, they can do it right here. I don't have a Patreon account. Epic Christ asks, what would convince you of the resurrection, PineCreek? I would say a tremendous miracle in Jesus' name, something today, tangible, even repeatable would be better. Like if I could see multiple miracles happen in the name of Jesus that doesn't happen in the name of Allah or Buddha or any Hindu god. But it's, if I was forced to say something that's not miraculous, I would say something similar to Camille. Like, think about it. A manuscript that could be carbon dated to first century, that's preserved in some lava pit in Central America, that mentions Jesus and Peter and all these guys. That'd be huge, because it's either aliens. The only other explanation I can think of is aliens, or that it's true, or how would that first century get there? Like,
time travel?
Time travel, yeah. Time travel is possible, or probable. No, not probable. Do you doubt your beliefs? Oh, yes, Epic Christ. I doubt my beliefs all the time. But I make very few dogmatic claims on knowledge. I make very few knowledge claims dogmatically. The things I claim dogmatically is this. I claim that when I let go of this pencil, it will fall. Now, Mike claims that the Gospel of Mark was written by a guy named Mark. That's a whole lot different than the claim I made. How is inspired measured by scholars vis-a-vis theologians when studying texts? Yeah, good question. It's that tingling feeling in your bosom. That's how it's quantified. Do you find it sometimes embarrassing that Mike's arguments are poor and easily dismissed upon further scrutiny? Oh, Nick Jr., they're not poor and not embarrassing if you're a believer and follower in Jesus Christ and you love Jesus as your Lord and personal Savior. These are tremendous arguments that have great impact and cause increase in confidence. But what upsets me, and people, intelligent, reasonable people can disagree, Nick Jr., but what bothers me the most is not hearing the other side of it. And that's what Camille and I hopefully did today, is show other hypotheses, other explanations. Like, anyone who I think is somewhat reasonable after hearing what Camille talked about with Richard Baucom should lower your confidence that Richard Baucom knows what he's talking about. Now, I know some people could say the same thing about, I referenced Dennis MacDonald. Yes, Dennis MacDonald's in the minority as well. I admit that. But in all these cases, we should lower our confidence, right? If we value this thing called truth. Beach Price asks, if an earthquake is punishment for sins and a miracle survivor is found, does that mean the deity punished the miracle person by accident? Yes. Chet asks, PineCreek, is Mike Winger good for Christianity? From my perspective, yes, because I want people to be, if they are struggling with Christianity, I want them to leave it. And I think people who listen to Mike Winger and think, oh, everything is fine in the world with my Christian beliefs, this is the Christian speaking, And if they agree, if they have listened to this video, and if they have agreed with 10% of what me or Camille have said, that alone is going to cause doubt, and that's a good thing if they're already struggling, because they can just let it go. They don't have to force themselves to believe this. They can just let it go. They can say, I don't know. It's okay to say, I don't know. It's okay to doubt. You're not going to die. You might have a little bit of existential angst for the first few months, but it'll go away. Saturn asks, let me see here. If we had the original of Mark as well as good evidence of authorship, would you believe that Jesus existed and or the resurrection? No, that wouldn't be enough. But the problem is, Saturn, I think if the reverse is true, well, no, Mike has admitted that even if the Gospel of Mark was not written by Mark, he would still believe. So I think Mike and I are on the same playing field here. This is not the root issue. But it still helps, doesn't it, to know when text was written, where, by whom, the sources. This should either increase or decrease confidence.
Yeah, I already believe that Jesus existed, so that's not an issue. But if the traditional authorship was true, that it would. But it would, if the traditional authorship was true, it would increase my confidence in the resurrection. It wouldn't be enough to convince me that it's more likely true than not. But it would definitely move it in the direction.
Yeah, I didn't see that Jesus existed. I just saw the resurrection. But Saturn, I'm not a mythicist, but I do put it just barely over 50% that Jesus existed. 65. Iron Chair and Tier, PineCreek, just a hypothesis. Do you think that Bible, New Testament Gospels were created by cynic philosophers at the time and then adapted by religions? The Bible has a lot of esoteric and Gnostic influences. I have no idea. Cynic philosophers? I don't think so. I think.
Yeah, I don't think so. I think these kinds of similarities can be explained by just like a cultural osmosis. You don't have to posit like a direct institutional or authorial influence. So yeah, I don't think so.
Epic Christ, PineCreek, how can you justify that? I'm assuming you're saying the pencil that I was holding earlier is falling. Your brain might be in a vat. You mean vat? Yeah, my brain's either in a vat or your soul is either in a vessel, right? Epic Christ. This is I don't want to offend you, but this is something that a kid would ask. Do you agree that I can demonstrate it for just not myself, but for Camille here and for others? That's not just my knowledge that we're talking about. It's other people's knowledge, that we can repeat it over and over and over again. We can test it, the effects of gravity. Now, can we do anything like that when it comes to theology or things 2,000 years ago? It's the historical method, not the scientific method, right? And so, yeah, that's my answer to that. And yes, my brain might be in a vat, but your soul is in a vessel, I guess. This whole stream will be viewed as an attack and mockery by a winger. I think I've actually impacted Mike on the word attack. He's using it less and less, I think. So that's good. Salim, what do you think, as an atheist, is the most convincing argument for God? Fine-tuning for a general deistic God? For Christianity? Amazing miracle, but I haven't seen one. Fine-tuning is still bad, though, in my opinion, but it's the best of the worst. Frozen Sea, Doug, it sounds like a contradiction to think that Mike's argument is powerful while also thinking Mike's argument will cause doubt. No, it's the perspective, Frozen Sea. For Mike's followers, read the comment section on the video we just critiqued on his page. It's powerful to them. Yeah, powerful to current believers. Would you feel safe if the whole world was converted to Christianity? No. How's that for an answer? There's some...
Yeah, I live in a country that's the least religious in the world, and it's been like that for like 40 to 70 years. And if you compare the various social economic metrics like depression, suicide, alcoholism, abortion, divorce, like Czech Republic versus the US, it's basically the same. So same depression, same suicide, same abortion, same
Yeah.
divorce rates. So I don't think it makes a difference. We have much less criminality than you guys have in the US.
Which is not what you would expect, right? If the Holy Spirit's real, if the Holy Spirit is real and powerful and is a helper to the Christian, you think you would see evidence of it. Adam does SC. Great question. Mike lets you speak to his congregation for 5 minutes. This is a hypothetical thought experiment. What do you say and what rhetorical questions do you ask? I actually, funny enough, Camille, you don't know this, but I had the opportunity to online ask a question to a church in Oklahoma, like, what was it, yesterday? No, this past Sunday. And it was the question on the flood, Noah's flood. And would you poof or drown? Or maybe I asked, did Jesus drown babies? No, I asked that one. Do you believe Jesus drowned babies? And I purposely go there because if you talk about this sort of thing, like Baucom's work, whatever, if you ask questions like that about the historical evidence, most Christians, it's just going to go over their head. They're not going to care. You got to hit them where it hurts. And where it hurts is their natural intuitions on things like morality. And Christians who are honest with themselves, who believe in the Noah's story, which in the United States, it's quite high. It's at least a third and probably close to 2/3. That hurts them. It hurts their brain, is what I'm saying. To think that the Jesus that they love takes his hands and pushes toddlers underwater until they breathe no more. This is an active punishment, justice, by the God. This also only applies to Trinitarians. I tell you, that impacts them. It doesn't impact, let's say, the cantankerous old men, but younger people, especially women who have kids of their own, I tell you, to think of the Jesus they worship and serve, drowning toddlers, infants, and babies, and the unborn, does not sit well. And then they have to battle with what they do with this. Boy, you're getting a lot of comments here. PineCreek, how does one need to be to do an interview with you? How old does one need to be? 18 or older? And then there's still no guarantee. There's no guarantees even if you want to have an interview with me that you'll get in. I'm kind of tired of the same old, same old.
Yeah, don't ask how much I had to pay.
You know what impressed me more is someone who scored in the top 5 percentile of the MCAT, LSAT, GRE, who's a born-again Christian evangelical. I'd love to talk to you. In fact, spread the word. If you're a Christian listening to this, I would love to talk to someone who's actually IQ 140 or higher. And who's a born-again, Bible-believing evangelical Christian. That would be fun to interview that person. Iron Chair Tier, where do you think Christianity would be today if they listened to Marcion to get rid of the Old Testament? Would they be as apologetic? No, I don't think they would. I think it would be much easier to be a Marcionite than a Christian. Much easier.
Yeah, and also the Holocaust would probably happen much sooner.
I shouldn't be laughing, but I think you're right. Yeah. Good point. Yeah, I don't. I prefer no drinking on my live stream, and no swearing, because I'm a good boy. Okay, I think I'm caught up. PineCreek from Nick Jr., if you could sit down with Mike and go down the list of many of his misconceptions pertaining to the Bible, do you think he would reduce his confidence in its validity? No. The only way a guy like Mike Winger would lower his confidence in Christianity is if he won $10 million and if his wife became an atheist. That would do way more
Yeah, I think
than going
what
through.
what I would hope to get out of a conversation with Mike is just to like correct him on some of the bad epistemology that he has, not necessarily to like deconvert him or anything like that, or just to make sure that when he's actually presenting the evidence for the resurrection, he doesn't say the things that are just a result of bad epistemology. So I would just basically improve his presentation, right? I think that would be enough. I'm not interested in like changing people's religious belief. I'm just interested in people having good epistemology in general. It's just if you have that, then deconversion is the byproduct, usually.
Joachim West asks, PineCreek, are you familiar with the Chabad Jews who believe that their rabbi, who they say did miracles, is the Messiah even though he's dead? Yes, I interviewed one on Blab, must be 4 years ago. They're a very small percentage, but I don't remember much. I think the interview went well, though. Would you do more Christian call-in shows, asked Adam? Maybe, but not with the bloviating Greg Kokel. Does Mike have kids? No. As far as I know, no.
Really? He doesn't?
No.
Isn't he supposed to go forth and multiply?
That's in the Old Testament, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I won't say anymore. Iron Charioteer, PineCreek, I think you should start your own radio show. There's a lot of Christian ones. Yeah, maybe. Maybe maybe a radio station will pick guys like me up. I don't like podcasts. I think radio would actually be better than a podcast. I'm still curious, PineCreek, what do you think Mike Winger's idea of utopia might look like? Heaven. Done. PineCreek, have you heard of the cumulative case for the dragon in the parking lot? Troy's he's a former Mormon, and he helps me a lot with the Mormon stuff. And I tell you, I posted the other day the minimal facts for Mormonism, and it works just as well as it does with Christianity.
It works much better. Like the quality of the evidence is much greater.
Joachim West, no, that interview with that Jewish person is gone. I should have saved all those interviews, but I did not. I saved like maybe a couple of them, but they were more like funny ones. Epic Christ. Oh, great question, Epic Christ. 1,000 pine points for your question. How can you justify your belief regarding atheism? I can't. Epic Christ, listen to me closely. I call myself an atheist, and yet I say this. There are no good reasons for atheism. For capital F, capital O, capital R, atheism. I'm an atheist who admits there's no good reasons for atheism. Epic Christ, if your brain has just exploded and you're going, well, how can you be an atheist then? I have a video on this called There's No Good Reasons for Atheism. Watch it. You can even watch it at 2x. It might take you half an hour. And you'll know exactly why I'm saying what I'm saying. A lot of atheists got mad at me when I said that, but that's okay. News Radio 820 KPINE, where Mennonites rock around the clock. Ask Camille what he thinks the world would be like if there was no fall.
Well, I think there wasn't a fall, so like this.
Troy asks, when can we get guys like Dr. Price back on? Well, Dr. Price is quite active on YouTube, so I don't know if I would get guys like Dr. Price back on, it would maybe be to humble and humiliate Christians through his vast knowledge, or to talk about something, or maybe talk about Christianity in a completely new, different way. Like, I think what I did with Dr. Price was the speed round, true and false, multiple choice. I think that's fun. I might do something like that with a guy like him again. The next generation is growing up largely in a secular culture. Thor, a god, is an avenger. We just need to work on filling the psychological and social needs gaps religious communities are providing. Yes, Reed. And this is for the Christians who really, really need Christianity in the sense that they would have nervous breakdowns. They suffer from depression or anxieties, or they're suicidal. Until there's a replacement for Christianity, be the best Christian you can be is what I say. There's a reason we evolved to embrace religions, because it gives us hope, meaning, purpose, helps us stay alive. I think atheists are freaks of nature. I've said this before, but if you truly don't believe in any God, I think you're a freak, because you're basically saying, I don't need these explanations of first cause. I don't need to attribute morality and all these things to a deity to have meaning, purpose, all that. This is why a lot of non-Christians go into yoga or believe in energy and new age type stuff, because they're finding a replacement, right? So a person who doesn't need any replacement, those are the freaks. That's who I'm talking about. Doorknob head, I like you. Epic Christ, Camille, he says you should debate Mike at Inspiring Philosophy regarding the resurrection or the reliability. Hey, great.
Yeah, I would actually like to debate someone on the resurrection specifically, because I've been watching a lot of debates, and I think in almost all cases the atheist or non-Christian did a pretty terrible job, to be honest.
Yeah.
So I think I would be able to present an alternative explanation for all the evidence for the resurrection, like the empty tomb, the testimony of women, the appearances and stuff like that. So yeah, we can set something up. I don't really care who the Christian would be, because I don't know if you noticed, but all the apologists are basically copy-paste. They recycle the same stuff. They might have a little bit like a different list of minimal facts, but apart from that, there's not really that much difference.
I can ask Mike, see if I can make it happen. I'd prefer it be on my channel than, sorry, no offense, James from Modern Day Debate, but I don't know if Inspiring Philosophy would agree to that. Iron Charioteer says, PineCreek, I know Camille is an atheist. I just wanted his input on whether the world would fall apart if there would have been a utopia. The original plan of God, what Christians want. I'm going to speak for you, Camille, and saying you really don't care.
Yeah, I don't really understand the question. What's the question again? What would happen if what? If everyone deconverted, or
I guess in the story, if there wouldn't have been a fall, would we have this utopia that the Christians want?
That's actually interesting. So I think, well, it depends on if you go by Genesis 1 or Genesis 2, because they are two different creation accounts. And I think in Genesis 2, Adam is created as basically a helper, like an assistant for God, specifically to be a gardener. So I think if there wasn't a fall, Adam and Eve would be divine beings living in the garden, which is basically an equivalent of Mount Olympus, where the gods lived.
Do you think divine beings poop?
That's a good question. I'm not sure if that's the consequence of the fall, but I guess you need a fertilizer in the garden, right?
Yeah, and if there was no fall, would Adam and Eve go ouch if they stubbed their toe? Would they stub their toe?
I don't think so. Do gods stub their toes on Mount Olympus? Probably no, right?
See, these are the real questions. Like, who wrote the book of Mark, the Gospel of Mark? That's nothing. Would Adam and Eve, did they fart? Did they poop? Did they stub their toe before the fall? These are the real questions that Christians need to ask.
Yeah, also, did Sauron had a physical form during the Third Age? That's what I want to know.
Well, did you have fun, Camille?
Yeah, it was good. Always a pleasure.
Yeah, I had fun. And Christians, did you have fun? I have a feeling no. I think they're all gone, except for one guy. Again, my apologies to Mike Winger. He was scheduled to come on to defend himself, but we ran out of time. Have a great rest of your week, guys. Go see Endgame if you haven't already. Did you see it, Camille?
Twice, and I'm going to see it at least once.
You've seen it twice already?
Yeah, it's really awesome.
Okay, we don't say no spoilers. No spoilers.
Yeah, no worries.